So I'm a newbie to conservation, and I was really uncomfortable with the militaristic, value-laden, and hyperbolic language often used in academic journals, conservation websites, and mainstream media when describing invasive species, especially when conservation management programs have missions to remove or eradicate invasive animals and plants, particularly if their common name included Asian, Chinese, Japanese, compared with enemy, evil, invader, menace, peril, foreign, and exotic, just really struck me at a visceral level.
Hey, I'm Michael Yadrick. I'm an ecological restoration practitioner living on Puyallup territory, now known as Tacoma, Washington. This is Treehugger Podcast, where we discuss our language about weeds and other organisms we think don't belong. In a bit, I'm going to whiz you back in time to March 16th of this year when we virtually convened the second of an ongoing dialogue and a working group that ventures to unpack our language about invasive species. I am happy to introduce you all to some of the instigators of these conversations. Chris Widmaier is an educator and community builder who focuses on creating systems change in our communities through ecological engagement. He is based in Rochester, New York. His efforts rely on a guiding philosophy that inquiry and dialogue paired with meaningful work lead to collaboration, communication, creativity, critical thinking, and the development of community. The power and diversity to build resilience and well-being in individuals and communities is a foundational idea for what he does. One can find more information about just language on Chris's website, greencollarcollaborations.com. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Then, Danielle Bunch is a conservationist, experience and place-based educator, and nature photographer in the Atlanta area. She connects young minds with the natural world through inquiry-based and experiential-based programming. Danielle creates programming that is culturally and academically relevant to diverse audiences. Bringing together her passion for nature with interpretive storytelling, hands-on activities, and student-centered teaching, she creates meaningful outdoor experiences. Then, there are two other folks that pop in on the conversation, Lisa Fink and Celeste Williams. Lisa joined us from Eugene, and Celeste I met in our Zoom breakout room during the first January Just Language dialogue. She is close to me in Seattle. I'll skip their introductions because Chris presents them to us in a bit. So, if you're wondering why we are doing this and what questions we intend to address, Chris, Danielle, Lisa, and Celeste will unpack it expertly in a minute, but I can tell you from my point of view that I have vaguely felt unsettled with some of the militaristic and wicked terms I find myself using to talk about plants that I have been trained to think do not belong. Invasive species are the baddies of conservation and restoration. As an example, here's an assertion from the National Wildlife Federation. Invasive species can change the food web in an ecosystem by destroying or replacing native food sources. The invasive species may provide little to no food value for wildlife. Invasive species can also alter the abundance or diversity of species that are important habitat for native wildlife. Accordingly, we label these species as invasive, non-native, foreign, noxious, or alien, or any number of disapproving characterizations. But why? The group circulated some great reading around, and I found a couple papers super insightful with reminders about our history and different worldviews on this subject. Mira Iona Inglis published in February 2020 an article in the Journal of Agriculture and Environmental Ethics titled Wildlife Ethics and Practice: Why we need to change the way we talk about invasive species. She describes a branch of colonial ecology called invasion biology, and the grandfather of that science was Charles S. Elton, who wrote the following in his 1958 The Ecology of Invasions by Plants and Animals. He says, I have described some of the successful invaders establishing themselves in a new land or seas. As a war correspondent might write a series of dispatches recounting the quiet infiltration of commando forces, the surprise attacks, the successive waves of attack and counterattack, and the eventual expansion and occupation of territory. We might expect ecologists coming up during the world wars to write in these anthropocentric terms, but accordingly it has colonized our language. Today, I catch other people offhandedly talking about blowing up a patch of Himalayan blackberry, or bombing, with herbicide, a monoculture of English ivy. That isn't objective science, is it? We also have defaulted to using these fortress and defense-like strategies to secure areas of ground where species we deem invasive are functionally extinct. Where does this come from? The men in my family were Navy and Marine Corps trained. I was not, however. I served in the Peace Corps. So I find this language has become normalized in American society anyway, that lives in this constant negative peace while also barely acknowledging our occupation across borders. Through the handful of conversations I've had with these folks and others, we have been unpacking the following questions. What are our biggest concerns about the language we use for invasive species or weeds? What names or adjectives should we purge from our vocabulary and why? What names, adjectives should we employ instead? Is there a more inclusive, benign, or universal language we can use? Which voices are missing from this conversation? Who is impacted and who cares about the issue? What other kinds of relationships with these organisms are possible? Importantly, there are other worldviews we should consider. Nicholas Rio and Laura Ogden in 2017 wrote about the Anishnaabe Indigenous perspective on invasive species. They uncover an awareness that 1. Plants that are new arrivals assemble into communities and even nations. 2. All plants have a purpose and use in relationship with humans and animals. And 3, perhaps the reason we deem some things foreign and invasive is that we have lost the relationship with these species during the emigration and moving around our ancestors have done over the years. No one has taught us the ways to use, interact, or harvest these species, while we have also dispossessed BIPOC communities of lands and ever-evolving cultural practices via colonialism and patriarchy. Interrogating our language can make us feel very uncomfortable. You may want to shy away from that, but if we lean in a little, I think we will find some personal and professional growth when we think and interact with each other on this topic. There are many takeaways with implications for our practice here, and it helps us be better human beings. Glad to bring you this perspective on language we use around invasive species. It starts right here. Enjoy this conversation with Chris, Danielle, Lisa, and Celeste.
So, anybody have any jokes?
Ooh.
About native species or otherwise?
Let me see. You want a dad joke?
Yeah.
Okay.
The
Here
dadder
goes.
the better.
I just looked it up. What rock group has 4 men that don't sing?
I don't know.
Mount Rushmore. That's bad. Ooh, that's a bad one. Sorry. It's not mine, though.
It's all good. I usually have a few on the top of my head. There's one that I always like to tell, and it's about the wooden car. Did you all hear about that? It wouldn't go. All right. I don't know what you would call this space on the internet. We're on the internet tonight. We're all on the internet. Callan, I don't know why you don't see elephants hiding in trees. Ellie, what do you call a nosy pepper? That is one of my faves. All right. But I want to hear when's the best time to visit the dentist. Welcome. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for coming to the Just Language Invasive Species Part 2 conversation tonight. If that's not what you were looking for, you're in the wrong Zoom room. You should go check your link. But hopefully everybody's here for this conversation because we really like seeing all the people that are interested in this. It's been amazing to see how much interest there is in this topic and this idea that we can shape the way that we all think about things, and that how inclusive we can be by thinking about the language that we use. And I want to start with just a quick introduction of Danielle and myself as two of the facilitators and leaders of this project. So I'm Chris Widmaier. I'm an educator and founder of a business I've called Green Collar Collaborations, where I'm trying to work with anybody I can find to build a hopeful and green future for all of us. I'm in Rochester, New York tonight, and I just really enjoy having these kinds of conversations. I think it's a really important thing to do. So I'm going to pass it over to Danielle, who will take it from here.
Sure. Okay. First of all, thanks to everyone who is here. We really appreciate having you guys here and your perspectives and your ideas. But anyway, so I'm Danielle Bunch. I am the senior conservationist for Clayton County Water Authority. It's one of the metro Atlanta counties. And I actually run their nature center, Newman Wetlands Center. I've been here for 6 of my 13 years as an environmental educator. I have been working to make our programming much more relevant to our community, more impactful and positive, hands-on, but also more inclusive. And that's sort of how we got here. So a few years ago, I was sitting in a workshop being led by Dr. Drew Lanham, who is an ornithologist, an author, professor, et cetera, et cetera. He does lots of wonderful work. And he was telling a story about this time he was with a group of Sudanese refugees, and they were on a field trip to learn about nature, and the environmental educator with them was teaching about invasive species. And she was using the traditional language most of us have been taught and probably still using. And you could see the looks on these students' faces and how the language they were hearing come from her about plants or animals was similar language that they had heard about themselves or maybe their parents. I casually worked on this for a while, trying to do better, think of new language I could use, but I didn't really find any answers. Fast forward 2 years, another visitor here, an immigrant from India, kind of had the same reaction to the language I was using when we were talking about a native plant garden he wanted to design. So I asked this question in a Facebook group, Urban E Collective. Some of you are in that group, some of you may not be, but it's a wonderful place for resources. And I asked the questions, how do you teach invasive species, about invasive species, and what words and what lens do you use? And we had over 100 responses, but we didn't find any solid answers. So Chris offered to work with me on facilitating a bigger discussion. And since then, we have done that. This is actually our second round of discussions, but we've had one in January that was many of you were in. This has also sparked other conversations, people in Washington State as an example, and a lot of their King County employees and Seattle employees. Michael, who was one of our facilitators, actually made this happen. And they had this conversation. Chris and I facilitated it for the Georgia EEA conference last week. And the takeaways we've kind of gotten from these first round of conversations are that we want an inclusive and universal language so that we can teach this concept, because this is an important concept to teach. We definitely need more voices in the conversation. We want to do this by having paid focus groups in the lesson planning, management practices, etc. I know there's at least one person in this group who's doing that in Raleigh. I hope that we'll get to learn a little bit about that maybe in some of the groups, the small groups. We also want to change our perspectives and how we view invasive species, and we need to take ownership as educators and scientists of the politics and culture of science. That way we can share what we're learning and finding out in our research in inclusive ways. And the last thing is that students see themselves in what they learn. So if you would not use a certain language or words to describe a student, you should not be using it to talk about a plant or an animal in that way. So during these conversations, we have two main guiding questions. First, how do we apply a lens of identity and diversity and justice to the topic of invasive and introduced species, and how we teach it? How is it taught? How do we move from inquiry to action? So our first round of conversations were really looking at the research, talking about the actual language, why it's not okay, that sort of thing. And now we're moving towards an action plan. So tonight we'll be talking about lots of strategies for different pieces of this work. Our goals all stem from the key points that I just covered.
One of the things that is really important about this is that we're bringing lots of perspectives into the conversation, and it's been really cool to hear about all of the different things people are thinking about and doing around this topic. So tonight we've invited Celeste Williams and Lisa Fink to just share a little of their perspective on this. Celeste is a graduate student of biology with a focus on conservation, communication, and inquiry. And her goal is to foster equity, leadership, and collaboration through storytelling, content, multimedia, and theater that allow people of color and other underrepresented communities to be seen and heard in conservation. Lisa Fink is a PhD candidate in environmental sciences, studies, and policy at the University of Oregon. So her dissertation project, Unsettled Ecologies, The Racial Discourse of Invasion, U.S. Empire, and Indigenous Resurgence, examines the settler and racial logics undergirding the narratives, policies, and practices related to humans and other than human beings considered invasive in the U.S. So I am going to turn it over to Celeste, who's going to give us a brief introduction to what she's working on. So go ahead, Celeste.
Okay, great. So thank you for that introduction. So I'm a newbie to conservation, and kind of like what Danielle was saying about her students and some of what she's heard, I was really uncomfortable with the militaristic, value-laden, and hyperbolic language often used in academic journals, conservation websites, and mainstream media when describing invasive species, especially when conservation management programs have missions to remove or eradicate invasive animals and plants, particularly if their common name included Asian, Chinese, Japanese, compared with enemy, evil, invader, menace, peril, foreign, and exotic, just really struck me at a visceral level. So I did some research into Chinese mitten crabs, and I found this kind of prevalence of words that personify them as intentionally causing harm versus being part of a global introduction through human actions. Find words such as infestation, pest, aggressive, steal, threaten, exploit, and predator. And I found headlines of news media and university publications, including phrases such as a menace to the West, send them home, mittened, mini monster, and outdated descriptions like from the Far East. So on a personal level, I have Japanese and Jewish roots, and these words made me feel tense and rebellious, and I wanted to defend myself and other communities who have been historically marginalized, facing prejudice, racism, and anti-immigration sentiment. So I would just really want to emphasize the power of words. That as a new person in conservation, I think I saw these words differently than people in my cohort, my facilitators and instructors, that these words can really create and foster negative perceptions, stigma, and even deep-seated prejudices against this kind of foreigner as a threat to our health and economy. And so in this website, I went a little bit into the history of anti-immigration policies and xenophobia. So I'm focusing on this because this is kind of what led me to these broader conversations. So Asians, particularly Chinese and Japanese, have been historically demonized in media and political cartoons as these immoral carriers of disease and public health threats. And kind of these perceptions kind of fueled that yellow peril rhetoric and anti-immigration laws. And as we all know, there has been a surge of anti-Asian sentiment since the beginning of COVID. Rhetoric used by the Trump administration labeling it as the China virus, Wuhan virus, has propelled xenophobic and racist actions, including slurs, spitting, yelling out phrases like "go back to China" against those of Asian descent. So these parallels of unwanted Chinese immigrants, human and crustacean, inspired this website and my play that's also included on this under Engage Through Theater, Invasion of the Chinese Mitten Crabs, that I created as a metaphorical story that intersects science, history, and conservation. So it was really important to me, as you can see, that the play's actors and participants were of Asian descent. I believe that reaching out to communities beyond conservation, particularly people of color and other underrepresented groups, allows for these deeper conversations and perspectives. And the play discussion afterwards revealed similar visceral responses to myself of words that made people feel uncomfortable, attacked, and unwelcome as a foreign other. So there's been some recent scholarship on looking into these war metaphors, value-laden and hyperbolic language in conservation, that they could be laden with potential bias, create a narrative of native versus non-native, good versus bad, and us against them dichotomies. And even language that includes a species crossing a border can reinforce nationalism and anti-immigration sentiment. And that portraying species as enemy killers can justify kind of warlike actions towards them. Some scholars have also questioned the ethics of invasive language that can justify polarizing and aggressive eradication programs in a society where we're trying to promote multiculturalism and unity. So I'm aiming to just continue these conversations about language around invasive species and demonstrate how words can amplify negative perceptions, reawaken prejudices, and justify military actions, whether plant, animal, pathogen, or human. So I'm currently doing an internship with the Woodland Park Zoo, where I'm investigating language around invasive species, and I'm planning on creating new content. And my main project is to create a best practice toolkit of language and resources for future communication, including social media and web content and other storytelling materials. And I'm hoping to replace this language around invasive species that's more demonizing and sensationalized to language that is holistic, inclusive, and non-polarizing. So my next project will be surrounded around the Asian giant hornet as kind of as a springboard into a wider panel discussion about language and pollinators. And I think that's kind of it.
That was excellent. Thank you.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
I had so much more.
Yeah. No, we're in really good shape here. Thank you. And now I want to turn it over to Lisa Fink.
Hi, everyone. Really grateful to be here to think and learn with you all. And yeah, I'm so excited about your work, Celeste, and looking forward to our conversation. So we're going to have a conversation next week. There's a lot of overlaps in our work. As Chris mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon, and that's on Kalapuya Ilihi, ancestral homelands of the Kalapuya people. I start from a similar place as Celeste in my work. Part of my project includes a case study about Asian carp. So I'm studying a lot of very similar things, but specifically in the Great Lakes region, and looking at the carp and responses to them in different contexts. And the new angle that I'm bringing to the conversation is really thinking about approaches to species considered invasive within the context of settler colonialism. So really thinking about how the language that's used around invasive species and then the practices and policies that are related to those are a part of settler projects and reaffirm certain racial logics and settler logics. The much larger part of the project is looking for alternative approaches. So I am looking to Indigenous science and Indigenous environmental studies to look for alternative language approaches and policies in responding to introduced species. And then I also look to immigrant communities for their responses and approaches as well. Really casting a wide net with a wide methodology. I have interdisciplinary training in environmental studies and cultural studies. So I read a lot of different texts, websites, YouTube videos, popular culture, poetry. I spent the last summer reading the Congressional Record everywhere, hundreds of documents about Asian carp. So just reading a lot of text and doing discourse analysis, but then also working in communities with interviews and participatory observation, really trying to learn about what are the practices and place-based knowledges that people have to share on this particular topic that might offer a different way of thinking about species considered invasive. And in addition to thinking about language, but looking at what are the ways of thinking that language is grounded in, and how do those ways of thinking and ways of being in the world need to shift in addition to the language that's used, and also thinking about ideas of what's natural, ideas of who belongs, and ideas of who has the authority to say who belongs or decide who belongs, and then decide policies in relation to those things. I think that is pretty much it in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lisa. It's awesome to hear about your work, and thank you to both of you for kind of setting the stage. So we've set this up as a cycle of inquiry. In the first round of the conversations, we kind of tried to take care of this starting with analyzing data, and then we went into framing our key questions, which Danielle introduced us to in the beginning, talking about the literature, research, and field experiences that we've all had individually, and that was where we started today with Celeste and Lisa. And so now we're taking that first step and moving on to the part where we're trying to develop and refine an action plan. Our goal is to establish a set of words that are split up into three groups that should be included in a universal language. We're unsure about the inclusion of these words, and then that should be included, and have some discussion around why we think those things are those words should be in those different categories, or that some discussion of questions are clarifications, things we want to understand better about these things. We want to recognize the context and environment matters, and what might be for one person, it may not be right for another person in a different context and environment. But we want to focus on that idea of action plan that people can implement locally, but that we can spread broadly. And then also just that local versus universal is recognize that there's a tension there. everybody can start to think about what words. So when we talk about invasive species, introduced species, you can start to think about what words, and you don't have to come up with a huge list, right? This is going to be the power of the crowd, where each group's going to come up with a list, and we're also trying to provide models that you can use with your organizations, with groups of people you work with, and we're trying to be real just open source about this and provide any and all resources that you might want to replicate this.
Thanks for finding Treehugger Podcast again and tuning into this discussion about and with just language. This is an invitation to join future discussions and working groups moving forward. I think I probably mentioned my fascination with language before, and this episode was a perfect opportunity to do a bit of a dive into the language of conservation. The language we use leaves a fingerprint on those around us and in turn changes us as our culture adapts and evolves. We want to move beyond symbolic change. My treehugger community stands united against racism. You probably know that hate against Asian American Pacific Islander communities has risen during the COVID-19 pandemic. On March 16th, the same day that our Just Language session got together, 8 people were killed in shootings at 3 Atlanta area massage parlors. And though authorities said the killer was not motivated by race, 6 of the victims were Asian women. This is the most gripping reason to reevaluate our naming and description of invasive weeds and other species, that we might be contributing to either the ever-simmering racism or explosive, hateful acts in our society. What we pay attention to grows. So although a code switch can be subtle, the discussions we have about how we communicate our ideas about the other can be powerful. We can get emotional about this topic because people are invested in invasive species. A couple desires of the Just Language group is to create a user's guide for alternative language. One could reference this guide when you are language switching in policy, writing, naming, and everyday chats. This isn't extensive and by no means vetted by the community, but the following are some of the words that have been kicked around. I think this really shows the power of language to be nimble. Potentially harmful species, potentially problem species, weeds of concern, intentionally introduced, unintentionally introduced, disruptive, displaced, adaptive, pushy, opportunistic. You might see some value in some of these substitutes as well as how potentially tricky this can be. I think it is best to try some of these out in real time and see how people react. Language is changing. Our imagination has caught up with us, and I see actual change or hear some rumblings. For example, King County in Washington State is revisioning names of introduced plants that could put blame on the people, culture, place of origin that have racist, prejudiced, and xenophobic implications. For 2021, the King County Board adopted the following common name changes: Bohemian knotweed to hybrid knotweed, or simply knotweed. Japanese knotweed to Itadori knotweed, or simply knotweed. Brazilian Elodea to Egeria. Canada thistle to creeping thistle. English laurel to cherry laurel. English hawthorn to common hawthorn. While we can espouse change from the front lines, this is something state invasive species councils can also address with official naming conventions and adjectives they use in their propaganda too. If your local or regional weed board or state council isn't talking about this issue, then you might want to send them the Green Collar Collab website or this podcast. It might just be the stimulus they need to start the conversation. If this leaves you unsatisfied or yearning to learn more, please join us. Reach out to me or check out the show description. It will be worth your while. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Treehugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about Just Language, or you can find out more about them online at treehuggerpod.com. We are on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show. Or tell a friend about the show. Music for the show was from Jesse Gallagher and Chris Haugen. Those tunes were actually called The Weed, I'm not sure which weed we're talking about, and Tumbleweed, Texas. Thanks for hanging out. See you soon.